Welcome to lesson 4 on the Dictators course. Today we're going to be looking at Nazi ideology. Now this is quite a small chunk, so it should be longer than 10-15 minutes. And there's never really been a bespoke question about this. There's nothing to stop there being one in the EdXL course, which is the partner to this. There's one about the Nazi ideology and how far it owes to racial theory. But for the purposes of this, think of this as more of a background. Now this will help contextualize a lot of the other factors we're about to look at, so you can't simply just skip it. A lot of what we're going to talk about changes in the Nazi Party, about how they win elections and how they are run once Hitler is in power, very much links to this. So the roots of the Nazi ideology comes from many different areas, and in reality this is something disputed and discussed, and I wouldn't worry too much about getting the nuances of this. Arguably it goes back to Rousseau. This is again very disputed. Rousseau was a thinker who argued that man was inherently good, however is corrupted by society. So therefore, on a small local level, democracy works fine, people work well together. But once people become faceless and nameless, they become riven with class, they become riven with racial tension, they become riven with selfishness. And therefore, you can't really rely on democracy once society gets to a certain scale, and that's certainly the scale that Germany is at during this period. And therefore, actually what's required is a sort of philosopher king figure who is not in it for power, but in it because they are a superior individual, able to act in the quote-unquote common will. The common will is the idea that the government, someone knows what's in your interest, even if it isn't in your immediate desire. So, for example, a war might not be in society's desire, but it will help strengthen the country and help them in the long run. And that decision is that of a dictator. That's debated how, why, etc. But that's the idea. It's not power for its own sake. It's power to help people, but against their own natures. And you can sort of see where this slots into Nazis and the idea of a dictator, not because dictatorship is based on divine right, as a monarchy is, but based on someone being a superior individual able to bring progress, even if it isn't necessarily gratification straight away. You can also argue most of what Nazism is comes from trends and ideas which are in Germany since the Reformation. Protestantism starts in Germany, or again there's another debate, but the ideas, everything from sort of latent anti-Semitism all the way to the nationalism, to the rugged individualism arguably, to the subservience to a national ideal, all comes from before Hitler. And at best, Hitler can be described as someone who takes different threads of ideology, none of which really belong to him, and he doesn't really add too much to it, but he brings them in a combination that when presented in the right way, when it's convenient bits are forgotten, as we shall see it the right way, they are all sort of emphasized and work well and are quite popular. You can also argue that Hitler is a product of the Romantic era, the idea of emotion over reason, the action over debate. I wouldn't dwell on that too much. We can obviously say he's a nationalist as well, and he certainly is driven by a strong sense of nationalism, but as we shall see, what we mean by nationalism is actually very different to what many people first expect when they're starting this course. The best thing to realise as well is, yes, there are all these threads, but Hitler and the Nazis create these threads and put them in a context that works for Bavaria, works for post-war Germany. So they will shift, they will emphasize, they will link, they will de-emphasize, they will decouple things insofar as they fit and are popular in Bavaria. So stuff, for example, debates on the Treaty of Versailles never existed before. But the idea of the sort of Jews or socialists as insidious interior enemies which need to be rooted out are long existence for centuries, arguably, at least in the Jewish case. And therefore we can argue that he's taking the post-war context, stuff that is immediate relevant to people, and ascribing these sort of cultural values, these cultural political positions, which most Germans have been raised in, and even if they haven't been explicitly told it, that latent anti-Semitism, that latent conservatism, that latent cultural conservatism, that latent authoritarianism is all there, and all they're doing is tapping into that and putting it in that unique modern context. So let's talk about the core elements of the ideology. So we'll start at the top and work our way around clockwise. One of the things which always shocks people about, and that's why I say shocks, anyone who's not been on the internet won't be shocked, but about National Socialism is that it is partly a socialist doctrine. This is very much the Bavarian context. Bavaria, Munich, working class district in a conservative area, yet working class people are not necessarily lovingly obedient to monarchist norms. Socialism is very much, and no one saw that email, socialism is very much a popular idea. Now, this is not the sort of revolutionary socialism or the ideas of Marx, the ideas of equality, etc. That's a very sort of leftist socialism, and that's defined as sort of highfalutin and Jewish inspired. We're talking much more of a gut working class socialism, one that's against the bosses, against the profiteers, for the men, for the stability of society, but one which benefits the poor. The idea that actually the rich don't deserve to be there, the elites don't deserve to be there, is a profoundly anti-wealthy, anti-elitist idea, and the idea of rapid equality very much exists. And as we shall see in the 25-point plan, there are many areas of that which calls for the nationalisation of certain industries, a massive welfare state, the right to work, destruction of the army. These are all things which are along that socialist idea. And this is because ultimately the Nazis, including Hitler, represent that lower middle class, working class, Bavarian post-war milieu. They've seen their old world torn down, and yes, it's the socialist fault, and yes, it's the Jews' fault, but also there's this lingering feeling that the elites have lost it as well. And if you're going in the Munich beer hall, and that's where you get your numbers, there's over 70 different right-wing nationalist groups operating in Munich around this time. So to get people at your beer hall, you don't say highfalutin, oh, I'll obey the elites because there are social betters. You say what makes them thump the table and go yeah into their beer, and that's how you get more people night to knife, and that's how you get members. Now, as we shall see, that's part of Hitler's sort of skill, but this sort of guts, let's deal with the war profiteers, let's make sure that the old people get looked after and the war heroes get their pensions, very much is popular. Now, although this will get dropped, as we shall see, we should never really forget that this is akin to the Labour Party in the same period. This is a socialism, but not an ideological socialism. This is a philosophical socialism or an emotional socialism rather than a political ideological socialism. There's no push towards revolution. So at best, we can say they are adopting extreme social democratic positions rather than that of a revolutionary socialist. This, as we shall see, will very, very quickly get dropped from 1924 onwards, when the Nazis wished to make a distinction between themselves and other radicals, but also ingratiate themselves with the elites and those in power, and that obviously requires the scary socialist part to be reduced. The next ideology is anti-communism. Now, this can seem at odds with socialism. Well, first things first, communism and socialism, at least in the eyes of the Nazis, were very different. Communism is a revolutionary force, one about class interest over national interest, is an internationalist force and associated with Jewishness. It is a violent, thuggish sort of philosophy. Socialism, however, is giving good, honest people what they deserve. So if we chart the difference, it's not about individual aspects of policy, particularly it's not about who the enemies are, but it's about the solutions and the vision for what society will become. And so while you can believe in a welfare state and taking the war profiteers, people who have made money off the war while good, honest, working class Germans have died in the trenches, taking their stuff away, very socialist, we can also simultaneously say that we ain't going to sort of live in a revolutionary society. We're going to have a social democratic one, but we do not like the corrupting, egalitarian, pitting German against German mentality of anti-communism, because the idea that fundamentally weakens Germany is a Jewish conspiracy, is a Slavic conspiracy, is an effete leftish conspiracy designed to sort of tame the strong German wolf probably, and therefore anti-communism is a profound sense of identity to define these guys against. And as we shall see, this is one of the most core ideas running through the whole era. That to define themselves by anti-communism means that they have a way of getting the elites to like them. It means they have a way of differentiating their socialist ideas, and still retaining nationalism, because obviously nationalism to communists is seen as a way of controlling the masses and therefore rejected. And therefore, the anti-communism takes a very strong hand. This is the idea that there's a communist conspiracy. It's funded by unnamed, although they're different names of different people at different points, enemies of Germany, and it represents an existential threat to the race. It can be designed to create the race, encourage people to become greedy, focus on their own gains rather than the country, and therefore push a self-satisfied, indulgent, ultimately destructive political idea on a country, therefore weakening it. The next idea is anti-democracy and authoritarianism. This is the idea that democracy is fundamentally flawed. Now, I would have mentioned this in a lesson already, but just to remind you that the idea of democracy being inherently right certainly isn't present in Germany. They've had most of their period of some form of dictatorship. Now, while there are elements and lip service of democracy in this period, it was by and large still a monarchy run by the Kaiser, or some people would argue it was an oligarchy controlled by the elites who controlled the Kaiser. That is a separate historiographical debate. Either way, the German people are not used to democracy. Now, it seems quite weird that democracy will be seen as bad, but essentially democracy can be read, particularly to people who are not used to it, as rule of the mob. People who get the right to vote will vote in their own interest, and if you look at the majority of people in society, they are poorer, and particularly if you are middle class or low middle class, you are very wary of this seemingly natural communist base, sort of indulgent, self-centered base looking after its own interest. And this is where that Rousseauian idea again comes in. People do not know their own interest, they need a common will. Well, democracy only encourage demagogues, people who will pander, give in, or suggest they'll give in to what the people want, even if it isn't the interest in Germany. Democracy can therefore be seen as a weakness. A case in point is democracy brought the end of the war. Because people weren't prepared to see the sacrifices that Germany had already invested, they cut the war short, and actually Germany could have won the war, according to some reading. So therefore, democracy is seen as an illegitimate form of government, which only leads to weakness of response, weak, greedy leaders who will tell people what they want, and doesn't actually lead to promotion of those who are skilled or those who are good. It leads to promotion of those who best tell people what they want to hear. Linked to this, therefore, is authoritarianism. This is the idea that actually society is best run when there is an order. In the absence of order, it is argued society will break down. People will become increasingly selfish. People will become increasingly self-controlled, and if people don't have a strong state to keep them in line, particularly those racial enemies, those social enemies, those biological enemies, for example criminals, homosexuals, prostitutes, etc., then they will lead to decline of society. And therefore, much like a father figure in a family, and very often the authoritarian state is sort of put in like a father figure, a paternalist, I will look after you figure, but which at the same time has discipline one should slightly fear, not because they are cruel, but because they will hold you account of your excesses. Then we see this idea of authoritarian really push through on the Nazi ideology. So Nazi from there does not say it is trying to be democratic, does not hide the fact it is a dictatorship. Rather, it sells the authoritarianism, sells dictatorship as a mechanism for strong government, a way of fixing the nature and the weakness of the state, and only ensuring that Germany will reach back its natural place. It's basically argued that democracy will undermine the stability and the wealth and the strength of the country. And in an era where countries are constantly in competition, that social Darwinist idea we'll talk about later, this only makes more sense to do. The next one is nationalism, Mineshaft. I'm going to sort of approach these two separately, although yes, they can be seen as very similar. Nationalism is not patriotism. They are very much linked, but nationalism as a political construct, at least in the Nazi case, is not as simple as I love my country. Yes, there's that there, but nationalism is the idea that one would essentially subordinate themselves to the state. The state is seen as a body politic. That means everyone is a constituent part of the state. doesn't necessarily mean everyone is equal. Very commonly in body politics, some people are the legs, some people are the brains, etc., etc. That's usually to justify differences in work. But essentially, everyone is a facet, a part of the German body politic, the German state. If those people are selfish, greedy, lazy, weak, then naturally the German state will correspondingly, because it's made up of cogs which are weak, lazy, etc., will be weak. Now, this is a problem if you look at the world through a social Darwinist lens. So therefore, nationalism is the idea that one should subordinate themselves in the interest of the national interest, the common will to some extent, rather than that of their own particular interest there and then. Linked to that is Volkswagen Mineshaft. Volkswagen Mineshaft is the idea, is a mythical idea which changes here and there, but essentially arguing that Germany was best in the vague 1400s to 1700s. We are vague because they talk about a past which is a bit anachronistic, includes elements of societies in the High Middle Ages all the way to early modern era. This is an era of political stability, racial purity, hierarchical order, people accepting their position in society, German strength, where the corruption of cities, the corruption of capitalism, the corruption of modern society, the corruption of moral norms have all been reduced. Interesting, Volkswagen Mineshaft has a very dubious role for the church. Notionally, there's not a role, but in all the propaganda there is, because that's the only way you can buy the Catholic support. But Volkswagen Mineshaft is essentially trying to design a people's community, people's community, which there is uniformity, there's unity, and there is organisation, and there's deference to authority. Very much a sort of stereotyped middle age sort of idea, which was never there, where honour, purity, order reigned. And this is the idea that Hitler will come back to. Now, as I will mention, what it means and what it is to change over time to whatever Hitler wants to suit it as. But it does. This is probably the most conservative part of Nazi ideology, because it sort of harks to a traditionalism, but not a traditionalism that ever existed, but a traditionalism that many people shared in the good old days. There's a very common idea that the good old days were never as good as people said it was. This very much is there, except for the good old days was not a generation, it was several hundred years ago, before seemingly, if you look at the common trends, capitalism, urbanization, racial diversity have all held its role. Finally, coming back to the idea of body politic, we have racial theory. If a nation is as strong as its different constituent races, as a constituent people, if you have people of lesser races, Slavs or Jews, corrupting the gene pool, weakening the average German through encouraging them to be lazy, encouraging them to be selfish, encouraging them to be self-regarding, for example, in the case of Jewish arts and culture, or weakening it by being present but not having the strength, the loyalty, the obedience, or the intelligence, such as Slavs, which Germany needs, then you would argue that the body politic of Germany is weaker. So in order to make Germany stronger, if you imagine it to be a body, you need to purge the virus. You need to purge the external foreign quote-unquote body, which has undermined the racial purity, because if you assume the world is coded in racial terms, everyone belongs to a race, and that has a massive effect on your attributes, who you are and how you behave, you will then argue those who present an inferior racial stock should be removed, because not only do they detract by virtue of not being as good, but you can argue that, particularly in the case of Slavs who bring communism and Jews who bring communism, they are infecting Germans with a cultural milieu which is defeatist, is weak, and we've seen this all in the Weimar culture stuff, and undermining the German race. So this is a way of looking at the world through races. Foreign policy is viewed through races. X will do Y because they are that race. We should treat Z with that like this because this is that race, etc., etc. So Nazi ideology cannot be understood necessarily as a simple list of policies, because as we shall see, they shift over time. But at its core, it has a gut socialism, as we see, that should evade in due course, a profound anti-communism, a sense of anti-democracy and a pro-authoritarianism, a nationalist and traditionalist Volkswagen Mineshaft mentality, and a profound racial coding. So how does it evolve? Crudely, I can divide it into four different areas. The Nazi ideology of the 25-point plan, the early Nazi party, we'll talk about this in more detail in a second, next lesson, was very much one of a beer hall in Bavaria. It's what sells in that period. It's the German party, when it was the Deutsche Arbeiten Party, and then changed its name to the NSDAP, the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiten Party, very much no different to the standard approach. It is a Mittelstand, working class core support. It's heavy on the socialism, heavy on the Treaty of Versailles, heavy on classic racial enemies, heavy on anti-communism. You could argue that this is National Socialism in its purest form, and it only becomes diluted in order to win votes. This is certainly the argument of the left of the Nazi Party, who, as we shall see, will keep causing problems because they believe this is the pure Nazi Party. I would contend that I would say to some extent Nazi ideology was always subsidiary beyond a few core ideas which could be bent here and there, and those which were core were not necessarily deviated from too much in 25-point plan. What we see is the socialist aspects of 25-point plan, those calling for nationalisation of certain assets, war profiteering to be ended, massive welfare state, start getting either reduced, or in the case of stuff like the welfare state, getting linked to Mineshaft rather than inherent socialism. They'll never lose the word socialist, but socialism comes to mean paternalism, the idea of reward for duty and obedience to a current order as opposed to the right because of who you are. Mein Kampf, we see a shift towards the idea of the popularization of Nazi Party, a shift to winning elections, and therefore Mein Kampf reflects this to some extent with a shift towards racial politics, Treaty of Versailles, and a more cautious nationalism. And this only increases over time as Hitler increasingly tries to court middle class votes, try and get elite support and money. He tones down the socialist aspects, he turns down the pro-war aspects of nationalism and racial theory, and Mineshaft, and puts it in a very tame, almost conventional box, whereas he is still obviously quite extreme, but the elements of it, the anti-communism, is not unique. Anti-democracy and authoritarianism is not unique and also not particularly unpopular. The nationalism becomes one which is much more about similar to patriotism than explicit subordination. Volksgemeinschaft becomes a woolly idea designed to get farmers inside, as opposed to we're going to force everyone to go back into the countryside. And racial theory focuses on a few enemies and isn't that apocalyptic, so it's enough to get votes. So what we see in the evolution is a much more traditionalization, conservative focus, and a focus much more on the simple elements of anti-communism, crude nationalism, authoritarianism for certain people, and common race baiting, racial theory. Socialism really drops as time goes on. So before we wrap up, what are our core notes to make? Well, the first thing to point out, and that's what we spoke about later, is the Gauleiters, something which you haven't learned already, don't worry too much about, but the Gauleiters, who are local party representatives in each of the geographical electoral areas, tend to vary their approach or their ideology. The anti-communism is very common, and the Volksgemeinschaft to electorate is very common in Bavaria and the sort of Catholic South, but the socialist aspect, and to some extent the anti-democracy, is sort of pulled away from, whereas in Berlin the socialism is very, very front and centre. Anti-communism tends to be slightly further away, and certainly Volksgemeinschaft tends to be very, very far away. Areas on the peripheries of Germany tends to emphasise the nationalism and the war and this racial theory aspect because they're very much close to the Slavs, or maybe they even live next to Slavs. So when we talk about Nazi ideology, the Gauleiters do a lot to distill it in its own members, and Hitler keeps it vague enough in his public appearances that he doesn't really commit to one way or the other, so it's very easy to use. There's also an argument of the internal ideology. What's the ideology of the people in the Nazi Party when they are privately talking amongst themselves compared to what the world sees? And particularly as Hitler moves to the more popular and elite orientated winning election strategy, the external policy becomes very, very much more vanilla'd. The internal policy actually is quite interesting. if Hitler's talking to, or leading Nazis talking to the left wing, it's still very left wing. If they're talking amongst themselves or to their right wing donors, it's very right wing. Essentially, it depends on which faction, which group you're talking to. But if we focus just on Hitler and we see what he means in his head rather than what he's saying to the internal factions, because that will differ, we would say that in reality it's one very preoccupied with racial theory, nationalism, and a sense of sort of foreign policy beyond all else, the preoccupation with war, the preoccupation with communism, as opposed to anything else. So the next one is the differences between leading Nazis. Again, we can argue, obviously Hitler is one of the most important people, and he will always, as we shall see, define the end goal of what it is. But as we shall see, the Nazi regime is incredibly chaotic, and particularly when the Nazis come to power and Hitler starts relaxing more, what Nazi policy means completely different things in different ministries, in different gals, in different areas, and different times. And because Hitler doesn't micromanage, in fact he doesn't really macromanage, he just sort of pontificates and people follow him, we do see a sort of large difference in policy and variation in ideology being reflected. Goebbels is incredibly loyal to Hitler's line. Goering doesn't care, it's just about the money. Himmler puts very much a racial theory element on. People like Frick are very much an anti-communist on. Obviously, people like Rom, until he dies, is the more socialist aspect. To some extent, Goebbels actually pushes a little bit more of the socialist aspect. And therefore, in reality, there's not one continuousness. As mentioned several times, social Darwinism underpins all of this. Social Darwinism is, if it's Darwinism, survival of the fittest of the species, this is the idea that men, women, people also exhibit Darwinist qualities. We are always in competition with each other, and therefore, countries are always in competition. One must live for the other to die. And vice versa. Essentially, this is the idea that Hitler and Nazis view the world in a constant struggle, a struggle where only one side can be victorious. And therefore, if that's the case, countries are the sum parts of all the people. And therefore, this is where the racial element comes in. First thing, racial enemies are enemies. There's a struggle between the races and only one race will win. But also, foreign races will corrupt and undermine the races, and therefore this is very much what underpins a lot of the sort of anti-communism, the anti-democracy, the nationalism and racial theory, this idea that Germany is in competition and will fall and if it becomes corrupted. And finally, we talk about Hitler's role. Ultimately, if Hitler was a Stalin figure where he defines everything and he might change his mind but it's very clear, then we can talk about an ideology. In reality, Hitler defines ideology, but he's always very woolly about most parts, and he says different things at different points. He changes minds from day to day and changes it from year to year. And Hitler very rarely writes anything down in terms of policy from after Mein Kampf, and there's a whole theory whether he even wrote it at all. Essentially, when we talk about Hitler's ideology, I don't think we can ever really be sure what we mean by Hitler's ideology. Beyond these 5 core themes that I've talked about, which are held to varying degrees and can mean any variation of different things. What does anti-communism truly mean? Beyond, I don't like communism, it can be manifested in about 100 different policies. The reasons why the precise ones follow often depend either on Hitler's rough feeling at that point, who happens to be in charge of that ministry that then does it, to anything else. So in reality, I think the big thing, and this will be more clear when we get into working towards the Führer and we get into the strong weak dictator debate, that actually Hitler's weakness and Hitler's poor leadership only encourages a diversity of Nazi ideology and makes it harder to say this is the core Nazi ideology. Okay, that was longer than expected. My voice hurts. I'm going to have a limb sip. But apart from that, hopefully that was useful to help contextualize a lot of the stuff. Until next lesson, where I believe we're looking at reorganization of Nazi Party, goodbye.